Okay, just for your information, this webinar and all of the webinars that we do are video recorded and are stored in our continuing training program, so that you can listen to these videos if you missed it, or if you want to review or anything of that sort. So that'll work. Okay, the lesson that we have for today, and the lesson is kind of, in our nomenclature, is kind of a lecture, a given topic. And in our context, we in our training are focused on operator qualification kinds of training, both the technical aspects and the regulatory aspects of it. And so ours, unlike a normal training session, a procedure is focused particularly on performing tasks that are required by the operator qualification system. And a lesson includes an individual task. Now, this is an unusual lesson, the first one, because it's just an overview of the OQ program requirements. That is, that what we're doing is going to look at the actual regulations for operator qualification that are contained in Part 192 and Part 195, which are the gas rules and the liquid rules regarding operator qualification. And what we're going to do is to carefully analyze the entire operator qualification requirements and define all of the tasks that must be performed if an operator is going to comply with the operator qualification. This is very different than the NACE type courses, which were generated to satisfy the requirement to have a corrosion control expert that was controlling the program. So the NACE kinds of courses are focused on theory and engineering and calculations, whereas the OQ requirements are focused on the technicians that are actually performing work and getting the work done. And so what the purpose of our courses is to fill kind of a gap that the operators are attempting to use NACE certification for OQ personnel, and the government is balking at it because it's different content. And so what we're trying to do in our OQ course is to cover the issues in operator qualification that the government insists be there, but are not included or contained in the typical NACE course. And we're going to cover each of those issues as we go through the class. I could also, yes, sir.
Frank.
Yes, sir.
I just wanted to make sure that you're watching for people knocking at the meeting.
I am.
Not for any latecomers. Okay. Okay. Sorry for interrupting.
It comes up on, I've got the participant list up, and it comes up on that list, and if anyone shows up. Okay, so specifically what we're trying to do in this course, and the course has 19 lessons in it, is to define each of the tasks that must be performed and how you perform that task to meet the OQ requirements. This is totally different than the requirements for a NACE program. And again, we have a separate chapter discussing that so that there's no confusion in your mind. Okay, the second thing that's important to know is that the OQ requirements, unlike the NACE kind of certification where you take an exam and you're then certified, the operator qualification requirements require that the individual be trained and know how to perform a particular task that he's going to be assigned, but he must always stay qualified, which means that there are much more extensive evaluation procedures that occur on a regular basis to make sure the individual really understands all the material all the time that he's performing the tasks. So that's what we're going to go over. Now, in our nomenclature, in our procedure, we're going to go into great detail to make sure that you actually understand each of the key ideas that you need to know in the operator qualification program. So our examination procedures are primarily there to test whether you really understand all of the key ideas, and if not, to correct those key ideas. So here is the general outline of what's in this first lesson. So again, the entire course is focused on making sure you understand all the tasks that need to be performed to satisfy all of the requirements that PHMSA has for an operator qualified person or an operator qualified program. This lesson in particular just gives you an overview of all of those tasks, and then the remaining 18 lessons covers each task in detail as to what you need to do to be able to meet the requirements of PHMSA. And so what the ultimate goal is to certify individuals in their ability to perform all of the tasks associated with satisfying the regulation. Okay, so what we're going to do, these are just headers, and we're going to go into detail as we go through the presentation. But this is trying to just give you an overview of what we're covering. And in this class, this lesson, what we're doing is looking at each of the things, each of the tasks that need to be performed in order to meet the OQ requirements of PHMSA. Now, an individual may not need to meet all of these requirements. An individual that is going to be qualified is qualified to perform a particular task, and he would only need to qualify for that particular task. So these are all the tasks. An individual may only be required to qualify for certain of these tasks. Okay, so what we're going to do first is go through an overview of the PHMSA requirements. Then the first batch of tasks that we have that an operator must perform is the operator must create their own operator qualification program, which is an assigned task to create an operator qualification program. The second thing the operator has to do is to comply with that operator qualification program. And the third thing is the operator must, as appropriate, update the operator qualification program. So there are 3 tasks. Now, again, understand how we're coming up to these. The way I came up with the tasks is I go through every sentence of the regulations and say, what would I need to do to comply with that sentence in the regulation? Then I go to the next paragraph or the next sentence and say, what would I need to do to comply with that sense of the regulation? And I keep records of all of that so we can justify when you're audited, or if there's a failure and there's litigation, that you can confirm that you in fact have performed all the tasks necessary to comply with the regulations. Okay, again, we're going to go through each one of these in detail, and then we're going to have a lesson on each one of them separately. So we're going to drill down further, but I just wanted to give you an overview. So the first batch of tasks that we need to perform are setting up the operator's OQ program. Now remember, the regulations say what they have to do. This program is going to say how they're going to go about meeting those requirements. So the operator qualification program is specific to each operator, and it must say specifically how he's going to comply with all of the regulations. So the operator qualification program has to take each of the tasks that must be performed and say how they're going to perform those tasks. Okay, and again, I don't know that I mentioned at the beginning, if anything comes up that you want to make a comment or you have a question, by all means, interject at the time. You don't need to wait. So does everybody understand what we need to be able to do, what tasks somebody in your company needs to perform, and it could be a consultant, what they need to do relative to a operator's specific operator qualification program? And again, the operator qualification program is the program that states to the world how they're going to comply with the OQ regulations. And again, you can't copy somebody else's. It needs to be specific to your program. Okay, so again, the 3 tasks, and remember in OQ, we're not talking about theory or chapters about CP criteria or something of that sort. We're interested in specific tasks that must be performed to comply with the regulations.
How are you?
So,
Pretty good, I think.
I'm sorry.
Good. I'm Jeff Thomas, one of the kidney doctors. I'm picking up for Dr. Sirota.
Okay,
Your kidney function looks great. The creatinine's nice and stable.
good.
You're making a lot of urine. Looks like we're getting fluid off. Did they have you stand up to do your weight today, or did they do it in the bed?
We haven't done it yet.
Oh, okay. The last weight in.
Frank, will you please mute Ed? Thank you.
I already did. Okay. So does everybody understand the concept of what we're trying to do? So to meet OQ requirements properly, what we do is take whatever we're trying to do, whether it's reading rectifiers or performing a pipeline patrol or whatever it is, we examine the regulation and say what task must be performed in order to comply with that regulation. And this is the first batch of tasks that we have to do to comply with the regulation, and those are related to the OQ program that a particular operator has. And that operator must create the program, comply with the program, and update as the requirements of the program change. Okay, any questions or comments regarding that? Okay, the second batch of tasks that the operator is required to do is to train personnel in 2 things. Number 1, what the requirements are of the OQ program, and again, they may not need to know all of the requirements, but they need to know the requirements they're responsible for. So the operator, the technician that is qualified, must be qualified under and to comply with the OQ program that we talked about in paragraphs 2, 3, and 4. And there are 2 things that the operator needs to be able to do. The technician that's going to be qualified is he needs to understand the OQ regulatory requirements, and then he has to properly perform the technical task. So a covered task might be related to, as an example, checking a regulator, or it might be related to patrolling a pipeline. But in addition to that, the operator, also the technician, needs to understand what the OQ requirements are, where a qualified person has to be used, et cetera, what records have to be maintained, all of the things that are required to comply with the OQ requirements. Now notice the regulation is very specific that you have to do training of the individuals, and also the individuals need to be evaluated to show that they can perform the covered task as specified in that operator's OQ plan. So it's very important to understand an individual is qualified to perform a particular task in a particular operator qualification program. If that technician is qualified to perform that task, as an example, for the city of Palo Alto, that may not qualify him to perform that same task for a different operator, unless that operator has the same procedure to perform the task. So the first batch of tasks we've got were related to setting up the OQ program. The second batch of tasks were to train the people in OQ regulations and specific OQ tasks, and to evaluate, as the regulations require, the ability to perform those tasks. So that's the next two things we're going to talk about. The next two things that the regulations require is that an operator or technician needs to be able to recognize abnormal operating conditions and properly react to abnormal operating conditions. An abnormal operating condition is a condition on the pipeline which, left unaddressed, could lead to an overpressure or a failure. So a technician needs to be able to recognize the abnormal operating conditions, not only with the task that he's performing, but any abnormal operating condition on the pipeline that could lead to a failure. And not only does he need to be able to recognize it, he needs to be able to properly react to that abnormal operating condition. And again, remember, recognizing an abnormal operating condition doesn't mean that if he notices something wrong, he reports it. That's not what it means. It means that the technician needs to go specifically through each abnormal operating condition that could exist at that particular point that they're making measurements, and confirm that that abnormal operating condition doesn't exist at that time. So we're going to go through abnormal operating conditions. The next thing that we need to do is to go through the OQ required records, what records need to be maintained, and for how long the records need to be maintained. The last two things are, we're going to go through the distinction between operator qualification versus NACE and other third party like IS Networld and other comparable certification. What the distinction between the two, because it's causing a lot of disagreement between PHMSA and the operators in terms of PHMSA citing operators for not having qualified people, even though they've been certified by NACE and other operators. And so we're going to go through then the program that we've put together to fill in the holes that the NACE and other similar certifications are not covering, and we're trying to cover the OQ related stuff so that they are truly certified under the OQ program to perform the tasks. Okay, does everybody understand what the pieces that we're going through? We want to go through what you do to set up a program, comply with the program, and update the program, what the requirements are relative to training and evaluation, what needs to be done relative to recognize abnormal operating conditions, and what records need to be kept. Now, you need to be very careful. As I go through the presentation, I'm going to make a very big distinction between what is literally in the regulations and what would be required according to good engineering practices, so that you can recognize the difference. Okay, so let's go through the requirements. Okay, the basic concept, I'm just going to review very quickly and then go through a poll so that we can check your knowledge. So fundamentally, the operator qualification requirements require that anybody that's performing a covered task needs to have OQ training, specific training for the task that he needs to perform, and evaluations and certification that that person can perform the task according to the contractor's OQ program, the operator's OQ program. Okay, so let's say it again. A company needs to have an OQ program that says how they will qualify, train, and evaluate personnel that are going to perform tasks that are in their OQ program. And that's what this program is all about. Okay, so let's go through some poll questions and see if we have a general agreement as to each of these important concepts. Okay, so we're looking now at this first learning objective, and what we're going to do in each one of these sections is do a brief overview of what was in the lecture, and then answer poll questions that will give you a chance to tell me what the answers are to each of these things that we've discussed. Now, again, the first thing to understand is the whole lesson is covering a task. And now we're looking at particular learning objectives within that task. And what we're trying to evaluate is, do you understand what the operator qualification requirements really are? Okay, so you should see the poll now. And the first question is, personnel who have been certified by NACE or other technical organizations meet the PHMSA OQ requirement and are authorized to perform PHMSA covered tasks. Is that true or false? Okay, if you'd answer that. The next thing is, the NACE certification meets some, but not all of the PHMSA requirements for operator qualification of personnel performing PHMSA covered tasks. Please answer that if, as you have time. Okay. And then select the responses that apply to PHMSA operator qualification programs. Each operator that uses personnel to perform covered tasks must have an operator qualification program. Okay, answer that as if that's the correct one. The next one is, PHMSA 49 CFR 192 contains the PHMSA operator qualification requirements for gas pipeline. Okay, click that if that is a correct response. NACE certification can be used instead of PHMSA operator qualification requirements when performing covered tasks. And please answer that if that's one that applies to the PHMSA operator qualification program. And personnel with at least 10 years of pipeline related experience are not required to meet PHMSA operator qualification requirements. Okay, so the first question question 1.1.1, everybody answered that as false. Okay, and what's false about it, Ed? What do you think makes that false? Oop, I got to turn his microphone on. Okay, Brian, could you answer that? I don't think Ed's mic is on.
Are you talking about the first one?
Yeah.
False.
Okay, and why is it false?
Because the NACE certification doesn't cover the OQ requirements.
Okay. Anybody have any comment to that one? Okay, the next one is kind of mixed answers that we got. NACE certification meets some but not all of the requirements for operator qualification. Let's see. Ed is not there. Brian. Oh, Brian, you're not Pixel 5?
Yeah, that's what I'm talking to you through.
Oh, okay. That's interesting. It's showing your mic.
And I'm listening to you through the computer.
Okay. Well, anyhow, the issue with 2 is the NACE certification does meet a lot of the requirements for operator qualification, but there are certain pieces missing So it's not like somebody that is NACE certified needs to throw away that certification. What is involved is they need to be able to perform the technical tasks, and NACE may cover that in a particular task, but it doesn't cover many of the OQ requirements kinds of things. So the abnormal operating conditions and the evaluations. So the correct certification that makes an individual really qualified to do all of the things PHMSA requires is the combination of a NACE type certification of the technical issues and the OQ certification that they understand the OQ tasks. Okay, number 3, everybody agreed that the first response was a valid OQ program. The only about 30% agreed that the PHMSA 49 CFR 192 contains the OQ requirements for gas operation. That is correct. It does contain the regulations for gas. 49 CFR 195 covers it for liquids. Okay, NACE certification can be used in terms of, instead of PHMSA operator qualification requirements when performing a covered task. No, the PHMSA requirements require that you meet the OQ program requirements of that operator to be able to perform the task. And so the NACE certification alone is not enough unless it meets all the PHMSA requirements. Okay, personnel with at least 10 years pipeline experience are not required to meet PHMSA qualification requirements. Nobody answered that as a correct response, and that is correct. And this causes a lot of consternation in the industry. When you say an individual is qualified to perform a covered task, you're not really addressing whether he knows how to do it and whether he is a knowledgeable person and whether he's going to get correct results. That's not the issue. The issue is to perform a covered task, the individual has to meet the OQ requirements of that operator's OQ program. So being qualified has nothing to do with, so as an example, I might teach a class to the city of Palo Alto to qualify them to perform a particular task. But unless I took the exam that is consistent with CPA's training and evaluation for that task, I would not be qualified to do the task, even though I trained everybody on how to do the task. You see the distinction? Okay. Here are the results of the poll. Okay. Everybody okay with that? Okay, the next thing the operator has to do is to take into account the regulations and make sure that he puts together an operator qualification program, excuse me, that addresses all of the issues associated with performing operator qualification tasks. So again, the program has to contain everything that the regulation says has to be done. And among the things that are required is creating the program, updating the program, creating a covered task list, updating a covered task list, perform personnel to perform OQ tasks, train personnel to perform covered tasks, train personnel to recognize abnormal operating conditions, evaluate the personnel's ability to perform tests. So you can see the regulations are very detailed on what must be included in an operator's OQ program. And part of the creation is to make sure all of those issues have been addressed in the OQ program. Okay, so that's what's involved in creating an OQ program. Okay, and again, holler immediately if there's anything. Okay, the first question, maybe I don't need to read these to you to speed things up a little bit. Would you please answer each of these questions? If there's any question about the question, please holler. Okay. Is everybody done answering the questions? Okay, so everybody answered the first one false. Let me share the results. That's true. True. Yeah, the last item, store required OQ records, you notice that there's about half agreed with that, and it is in fact correct that one of the things the program said has to comply, has to include is how you're going to create and store records. Okay, the next thing that the operator must be able to do as part of his OQ program is to comply with the program that they've developed. Now remember, the operator has to create the program and then comply with it. And to comply with the program, he has to perform in a timely manner each of the tasks that are required to be performed. And the tasks that are required to be performed are called covered tasks. When somebody else is in the waiting room, I just. Okay, so let's follow the logic again that under paragraph 2, the task that was being performed was to create an operator qualification program that an operator must have in place. Now, the second thing that has to be done is the operator needs to comply with that program. And by complying with the program, we mean that the operator or his surrogates will perform all of the required tasks in a timely manner. That's what comply means. Okay, so let's look at the poll. Okay, if you would you answer the questions in the poll? We'll see if there's any significant misunderstanding. Okay, is everybody okay? I'm going to close the poll. Okay. As you can see, everybody agreed on one. To comply with means the same as create, and it's not. You have to perform all the tasks that are required. Number two, an operator must perform all tasks on time to comply with an OQ program. It's true. All tasks is true. All tasks is true. And number three, all tasks must be performed by a company employee. And the answer is no, contractors can be used. And that's not true. Okay, the last thing related to an operator qualification program is we need to update the operator qualification program whenever necessary. And what would be necessary? Any change to the operator qualification program has to be made if the system changes the requirements. So as an example, if a program, an operator did not have Impress Current CP and then added Impress Current CP to their system, that would require a change in the OQ program. It would require a change in the training. It would require people to be certified in that particular task and so forth. And so the issues with updating an operator qualification program, it must be done by somebody who is authorized to update it. It must be done by somebody who's qualified to update it, and it must contain all the changes that have occurred in the system. How often does that need to be done? Anytime that a change is made to the operation that is going to change any of the requirements of the OQ. Okay, can you answer these questions, please? Okay, everybody done with the answers?
Frank, I have a little issue because I think for question 3, none of those should be selected, but it's not letting me submit unless I select something that I think is wrong.
That's interesting.
I don't know if anybody else is having that problem, but I believe all 4 of those are not correct.
Okay. Thank you. I'll make a note of that and see what's wrong. So it's confused when you don't answer any that you believe that none of them are correct, but it believes you haven't answered the question. No, yeah, that you haven't answered the question. That's interesting. Okay, we're going to go through this, but make sure you understand what we're doing in these questions. The OQ regulations require that at all times the individual knows all of the issues relative to the tasks that they're performing and all of the issues that apply to them in terms of OQ. We're getting rid of the concept of passing and failing. What we're trying to do is during the lecture, as part of this, we're asking questions on every single learning objective and every single key idea, not with the idea of determining whether you know it or whether you don't know it, but to use it to determine whether there is anything that you misunderstand, with the motivation of discussing it and getting rid of the misunderstanding so that you can pass the exam. Now, when we give a certification exam, which are not going to be included in the introductory course, but when we give a certification exam and the person does not have a passing score, we don't say the individual fails. The individual, in fact, just goes to a tutoring session like this where we review the topics, and then another set of questions are asked, and we repeat the process until all misunderstandings are hammered out of the system. So our goal is not to teach some stuff and then pass and fail a student. Our goal is to teach some stuff, make sure the student understands all of that, and if in fact it slips through the crack and they don't pass, then we go back and do another certification procedure like this to make sure that we've taken care of any misunderstandings. Okay, so let's go through okay, let me share the results. Bear with me a second, I want to make a note about Davis. Okay, any PE can make changes to the OQ program. Everybody recognizes it has to be somebody who's authorized and qualified. An operator qualification program must be updated if a new pipe is added to the system's operating system, to the operator's system. Okay, as you can see, 33% said true and 67% said false. Does anybody want to comment on the correct answer?
Want to comment?
I may be correcting it. If it's the tasks that guide, if there is a lesson needs to be done in qualification and so forth, simply a new pipe doesn't mean there's a new task. It just may be a few feet, it may be something similar, but if all corresponds to all the assigned tasks and all the training and all the records and everything else, then I don't think a new pipe does that. Thanks.
Anybody else have any comments? I absolutely agree with Whit that if the new pipe doesn't change the requirements of the OQ program, then the OQ program doesn't have to be changed. Okay. Now there's also some disagreement in the selecting the correct responses. So first of all, is it correct that the system the operator qualification program needs to be updated once a year? And the answer is there is no time base that says you have to update the OQ program. An OQ program could stay as it is for 25 years, as long as nothing changes in the operation of the system. Okay, does everybody understand that? Because a lot of people answered that as correct, and it's not correct. There is no time base. And again, remember, I'm trying to trap you into wrong answers so that we can correct any misconceptions. And again, I can't emphasize this strongly enough. In all of our training, we don't want anybody to fail. What we want to do is to give an exam to determine if there's anything in any minutia that the person doesn't understand or misconstrues, and then we want to correct that and iterate through that again. So this basic concept that people have to fail is nonsense. It's our job to train people to do the job correctly. So this function is trying to trap you, so you shouldn't be embarrassed if you've given a wrong answer. That's exactly what we're trying to do, is to find wrong answers so we can correct the problem. So again, unlike many of the regulations, there is no time base on the OQ, on updating the OQ program. It could be that if the system is rapidly being modified, it might have to be done every 2 months. But WIT was actually on spot that if it does not, if whatever we do to add the pipeline doesn't change the OQ requirements, then you don't have to update the program. Okay, the next thing is that it must be completed by a professional engineer, the update. And again, does anybody have any comments as to what they perceive that the answer? You can see 33% said yes and 67% said no. Anyone want to comment? Okay, I agree with those that say no, that it shouldn't be.
I'll comment if you want. You know, there's a lot of professional engineers in electrical and civil and all these other things, but they're not pipeline engineers. And so I don't think it's necessarily a professional, it's the assigned person from the company or something. So that does that.
Yeah, it has to be qualified, which means he knows, he must know how to perform that task correctly and when it needs to be updated.
I think a good distinction here to make would be that do you need a PE to update the program? And no, you don't. You just need to be qualified and assigned.
Yeah, and that's generally true in the regulation. I don't know of any place where it specifically requires a PE. They always use the nomenclature a professional engineer or equivalent. Okay, the next one is it must be performed by the CEO of the company. And again, the issue here is it could be any individual that the company assigns to update, and that individual, that means he's authorized, and then that individual needs to be qualified in knowing what needs to be updated. Okay, and it must be performed, that is, it needs to be updated if an employee fails a qualification exam. And many of you have answered yes, and the answer is no. This has nothing to do, if the person fails a qualification exam, by our procedure, we simply determine what he failed to understand and correct that. It had nothing to do with changing the OQ program. It would have to do with changing or correcting any understandings an individual has. Does anybody want to comment on the concept of failing a student versus identifying what the student misunderstands and correcting that? Does anybody misunderstand that? Because that is not common knowledge, and it's the basis of us doing all of this polling. The purpose of all of this polling is to try and identify any area that an individual might be confused. And what we're trying to do is to test every key idea that is in the particular topic. And we're trying to drill down and find anything that students misunderstand so we can correct it.
Okay,
So what you're trying to do
I-
is not determine the correct answer. You're trying to determine why a particular answer is incorrect.
okay, I simply punched that just so I could submit my results because I had to have some answer in there. And so I just punched that number one. Number two, and then to make the comment that if students are commonly failing something on a test, then the test may need to be examined or the training may need to be examined or something. But a single student failing, no, that's of no significance. And we'd just be just like this, clarifying why the student answered like he did and so forth. So anyway, that's why I punched that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It could be a one-off for that student that he just had a blind spot. It could be that the training is bad, or it could be that the question was bad. And we need to resolve all of those. But again, the concept that I'm trying to point out is that this is not an issue of OQ. This is the issue of the way FARA addresses OQ. And what I'm trying to emphasize here is I refuse to consider the concept of a student failing. He may get tired of being tutored and taking the exam, but what we're trying to do is go through a process of evaluating whether the individual understands all the content. If he doesn't understand the content, we get rid of the concept that he failed, but we identify what things the individual didn't understand and correct those. And this has nothing to do with trying to be a nice guy. This has to do with the fact that what our objective is to make certain every student can perform the task assigned to him at all times, not just on the day he passed the exam, but all the time. And so we'll talk about the concept of continuing education. And one of the advantages of being able to do this in a low-cost webinar approach is that students can be continuously brought through this process to identify anything that they begin to misunderstand, either through atrophy of the knowledge or watching bad habits of other people. Our goal is to trap errors and correct them. Does everybody understand what the concept is? So we've gone through the issues associated with the OQ program, to create the OQ program, to comply with the OQ program, and to update the OQ program. So again, understand what we're doing. I'm giving you a checklist that says, if you say you're complying with the OQ program, what do you have to do to confirm that you're complying with that OQ program? And let me make sure you understand that when a regulator comes to inspect your OQ program or anything else about your O&M manual, they are not asserting that they've examined the entire program and that they've trapped all errors. They've simply said they're looking for certain things, and if they tell you that they've not found any problems, that does not mean you don't have any problems. It just means that what they were looking for was okay. Now, the reason that is so important is that the main issue for you is not making sure that the regulators don't fine you. The most important thing is, if you have an accident and you're in litigation, you want to make sure you're in compliance with the regulation, because there the consequences are enormous. Okay, the next thing that we went through is the issue of training personnel And again, let me make sure that you understand, the original OQ program was set up on the basis that the technicians that were performing the tasks very often made mistakes, and most of the failures that occurred were associated with technicians making mistakes. And the purpose of the OQ program was to improve the quality of the technicians. I might point out the National Transportation Safety Board and other similar organizations have all specifically said training was deficient, for instance, in integrity management and so forth. Now, the OQ regulations have put in a lot of paperwork, but I don't know of any technicians that are seriously being more thoroughly trained, which was the objective of OQ. So that's what we're trying to do, is to improve the training by trapping any errors that an individual or any misunderstandings that an individual might have. The regulation specifically requires training. So if your company does not do specific training to qualify people under your OQ program, then they're not complying with the regulations. And the fact that an individual passes the exam doesn't mean that training wasn't necessary. Now, the required training that needs to be done under the PHMSA regulation is trained to that an individual can perform any tasks that are assigned to them, that they can complete the required reevaluations, and we're going to talk more in a whole chapter on evaluations or a whole lesson. They need to be able to recognize abnormal operating conditions, and they need to be trained to properly react to these abnormal operating conditions. And remember, the issue of abnormal operating conditions is of the utmost importance in technician training, because very often the technicians see portions of the pipeline that the engineers and the managers never see. And if they don't recognize an abnormal operating condition, it could go undetected and lead to a failure of the pipeline. So these are the issues associated with training personnel, and they need to be trained to cover OQ tasks. They need to be trained to perform all the required OQ tasks and all of the covered tasks that are covering the actual technical measurements, such as close interval surveys if they're required to do those. And again, each of these are only the tasks that they're required to do. And it could be pressure relief valves, calibrating them. It could be troubleshooting rectifiers, whatever is in the OQ program. We've been at it for an hour now. Do you want to take a 5 or 10 minute break? Or do you want to go on? Anyone want to take a break? Oh, we got Richard. Okay. I'll move on. If anybody needs a break, holler at me. If you would, please answer these questions relative to. Hi, Richard.
Hello.
Hope everything went well in your conference.
Yes, yes, everything's good so far.
Good for you.
Caught up on a few things, so sorry we're late, but I'm here now.
Well, it just wasn't the same without you. I'm just kidding. I'm glad you could make the last part.
Yep.
Okay. Okay, the first one is technical training is not required for personnel who have been certified by a technical organization. Everybody said that's false. Everybody agreed on question 2, that training is required for all tasks assigned to a technician to perform. Now, there's a disagreement on 67% said that required tasks to comply with OQ regulations.
Okay, that was likely me. And my point is on this question, I think it's not correct to say that a person has to recognize all abnormal conditions. He has to recognize the ones he's been trained in. If he takes readings, he has to not recognize things that the readings would show. If he's not a board operator, how would he recognize board operating conditions and so forth? So I just think that the training that you train and you mention the abnormal conditions, they have to apply to things that he understands and then would recognize and then know how to respond and stuff like that, because he understands that task and how it responds. Thank you.
Yeah. Anyone have any additional comments on that?
Be able to mute it.
Yeah, I think what you said Whit, is fair, but the regulations do not put any restriction on it. It just says the technician needs to be able to recognize abnormal operating conditions. And I would recognize that to be, I would interpret that to mean that any abnormal operating condition that he could come across in the performance of his duties, he should be able to recognize as an abnormal operating condition. And I think that should be part of his training. And if an individual is not trained to detect a given abnormal operating condition, that wouldn't be a failure on the part of the student, it would be or a technician, it would be a failure on the part of the OQ manager or whoever.
Okay, I strongly disagree. I'll be glad to be the expert witness against the government on that because I've been out there in the field for real in abnormal conditions. And I can tell you that some contract CP1 person out there will not recognize all the things he might bump into. He might question them, but if he doesn't have anyone to answer a question of or whatever else, he's not going to respond. He's not going to see all these abnormal operating conditions. I've done it. I've flown over pipelines with people dispatched and found them, but I knew what I was doing. And everybody did their part of the tasks of identifying the problem and resolving it, as I've said before. So, but I think this is incorrect. If you think a beginner with 30 days or 60 days experience is going to respond everything that you cannot identify, you cannot list right now, all the possibilities that are out there or little indications that are out there, I think that's a BS. I'll be glad to make $250 an hour against the government. Thank you.
Frank?
Yeah, I don't, go ahead.
Yeah, Frank, whoever was speaking before Whit hit the nail right on the head. Having sat in on government meetings and working with the government, he said it just absolutely correctly. Now, I know where Whit's coming from, and I hope Whit gets his $250 an hour. That's kind of cheap, Whit. But anyway, the gentleman, whoever spoke that, whatever he said there was right on. And now bear in mind,
I don't know what you're,
I'm sorry.
I don't know what you're referring to. What did somebody say that you agree with?
I think he's talking about you, Frank. I think what you were saying is that the government doesn't tolerate any understanding of AOCs and how to react and stuff. I think he's agreeing with you at the moment.
Oh my God, that's a shock.
No, so I think somebody was speaking before Witt and defined it. And Witt said that he would be happy to go against the government on that. I don't believe it was Frank. It was somebody defining what they thought abnormal operating condition meant. And it meant that you had to look at and train for any abnormal operating condition that could be on your system. And whoever said it did it very eloquently. And it was exactly what the government means.
I'm not sure I understand. Could you explain it some more, Ed? I'm missing your point.
Which,
I don't know how to make it clearer, Frank. Whoever was speaking, and we might have to go back to the recording, whoever was speaking prior to what Witt said, and I don't know who that was, they were defining an abnormal operating condition when they said all. And they were defining what all meant. And they were defining that all basically meant any and all abnormal operating conditions that could exist on their system that they could be aware of and that they would be trained in. And that's what I heard.
To me, okay, let me elaborate, because I don't think I disagree in principle with what Witt is saying. I think we're verbalizing it differently. Okay, from a good engineering practices and from a regulatory documentation, the goal of this process is for the technician who is out making measurements detect anything that could compromise the integrity of the pipe. I mean, common sense would tell me, excuse me, I want that individual to be able to detect anything that, excuse me, golly, should be able to detect any abnormal operating condition. I also want that individual to properly react to that abnormal operating condition. What that means, though, would depend upon the level of the person. It might mean, for the example Witt used, a new technician with 2 years experience, 2 months experience, that he comes and he sees a trailer on the right of way. That's an abnormal operating condition. And he may not know what to do about it. He may not have any skill set that tells him that, but maybe his procedure or proper reacting to the abnormal operating condition is to simply call his supervisor. So if he recognized that a trailer didn't belong there, and he recognized that he needed to tell his boss that there was a trailer there, or the landman, or whatever the deal is, that's what is required. Now, I also agree with Witt's point that we, as authors of this material, are not likely to be able to anticipate every abnormal operating condition that could occur. But that certainly would be our aspiration. And insofar as we didn't list all of the abnormal operating conditions that could occur, that would be a failure on our part. Does that make sense to you with what I'm saying? That I don't know that I can anticipate all abnormal operating conditions, but I sure as hell can try. And I can add it to them as I find new ones appearing. I can add to the list.
Okay, I could maybe find ground in between us because, you know, our first step was to set up the OQ program, you know, for an operator. Operator set up his own OQ program. And if he can, and possibly with Farah's assistance, identify all the AOCs that would fit his program, then we could add that list for him. We might have 300 items on the list and he might check 87 of them or 187 or whatever. But if he checked those off, then we might be able to then train. These are the recognized, known, or possible AOCs and so forth. And then who he calls is a proper reaction. And I'll give one more story. One time I carried a camera and I was out on the interstate, well, not an interstate, well, whatever, 225, Pasadena, Texas. And I took a picture of a backhoe digging with my pipeline sign in between his back wheels. And he didn't have to respond to 811, you know, dig calls and dig ups. This was, you know, 30 years ago. He was with the phone company and he didn't have to call when he was digging. So I took his picture of his face, his license plate and everything else. And then I called the phone number up in the Midwest and told his boss I was getting ready to identify who's going to shut down the freeway and kill people. And I have pictures of all the involved people. And I'm going to be on the news and you're going to see your name there. And you know what? They changed their policies after that. But that's my point, is you cannot think of all the stupidity and the ignorance that's out there. And then, of course, then you have, we're going to have on the list intentional. There can be, you know, there's things going on out in the world. There might be some intentional damage to our pipeline and stuff. So having said all of that, I think that if we have a list and it's a standard list to check off for everything, then we might be able to say we've trained in that and trained them what to do, who to call, what's the phone number. Thank you.
Well, I agree with what you're saying, because 9 times out of 10, when you went to ask an operator about an abnormal operating condition, it was like a deer caught in headlights. So our goal here, I thought, was to ensure that we hit the majority, if not all, of the possible abnormal operating conditions.
To understand the distinction, basically what the industry is doing now is to say, I want the technician to tell me if they notice an abnormal operating condition, which means they may notice, they may not notice. If they've not been trained, they probably won't notice, and so forth. And what we're saying is we want to be able to say, these are the things I want you to check for to see if those bad things exist. And that's a different concept. Now, we're getting into the weeds by saying, well, is all the correct terms or all the common or the ones we know about or the ones we think about? I agree with all of that. The second thing I pointed out, do you see the importance of what these questions are doing? Not only do they evaluate whether a person gives the correct answer or not, but we've generated a discussion that emphasizes how important it is for the technician to be able to recognize abnormal operating conditions and what we need to put in our OQ program to get the list better and better and better as we recognize more things that we want the individual to look for. Okay. The next thing is training required on all tasks associated with pipeline operations. Okay, and about half said yes, or a third said yes. and others said no. Does anybody want to comment on that? Okay.
Well,
if
okay,
the-
I thought it's with the operations or the tasks listed by PHMSA. I thought the tasks have to be, or what we're trying to do is cover all the PHMSA tasks, listed tasks. So that might not be all tasks associated with pipeline operations. It's specifically geared towards PHMSA's OQ requirements and those tasks. Thank you.
Does anybody else want to comment? Okay, I absolutely agree with Whit, and to use the correct nomenclature, the individual needs to be trained only in regards to the covered tasks. The covered tasks are the tasks that need to be, and we're going to have a whole section on how you create a covered task list. But a covered task is a task that needs to be performed to comply with the OQ regulations. And so if it's not part of the operator's OQ plan, or it's not assigned to an individual technician, then that individual does not need to be trained. And certainly does not need to be trained under the OQ program for all pipeline operations. It's only those that relate to OQ. Okay, so let me say again, we're not required under OQ to train an individual in all pipeline operations. It's only those pipeline operations that are required by the OQ program to be performed. And part of what we do when we're creating an OQ program is to create a covered task list, which is a list of those tasks. And we're going to go through the step-by-step procedure by which you create a covered task list, how you determine whether a task is a covered task. Okay, so that answer is incorrect. It's only covered tasks that we need to do training in. We need to do training on to successfully complete required evaluations. And again, roughly a third said yes. Okay, the important issue here is that evaluations are required on a time base that everybody recognizes. That for each task, you create a time interval in which the evaluation has to be reperformed, and the training that an individual needs to have is to update him so that that individual can pass the evaluation. There are also a number of instances that occur that require an evaluation, even if it's not time for the evaluation. So if an individual is involved in an incident or an accident, that requires a reevaluation of his task. If an individual is seen to be performing a task incorrectly, that would trigger a reevaluation. So we have to train the individual to complete all required evaluations is true. That part of the training is to train an individual to complete the required evaluations. Does anybody have any comments on my comments? Okay, the next one again was a mixed answer. Does the training have to associate with recognizing abnormal operating conditions associated with each covered task? Anyone want to comment on that? Okay, my response to that, or my intention in writing that question, is that part of the training should be to train an individual to recognize all associated abnormal operating conditions, which means you've got to train the individual as to what they're looking for, what symptoms they should see, to come to the conclusion that an abnormal operating condition exists. You cannot assume that an individual knows what will determine that an abnormal operating condition exists. We need to specifically say, if this abnormal operating condition exists, you will see this, this, or this, or this, and this, so that that individual can make the decision. So again, if our objective is to make sure that the technician is able to tell to bring to management or to a supervisor's attention any condition that could lead to the failure of the pipe, we've got to give them the tools to do that. That's what Whit was saying before, that if we don't train them to do that, then we can't ask them to do it. Okay, and again, the last issue is the same. Do we have to train the individual to properly react? And the answer is yes. And that proper reaction may differ if the individual is a technician or an SME or whatever level the individual is, because properly reacting in one case may be to solve the problem by getting the intruding vehicle off the right of way, or it may be just telling somebody so that they can solve the problem. So the properly reacting doesn't necessarily mean to solve the abnormal operating condition. It means to react properly so that the problem does get corrected at the appropriate level. Okay. Everybody good with that? Any? Oh, I should have shared the results when I was talking. I'm sorry. Okay. So as part of the training and part of the evaluation, we need to evaluate that an individual is able to recognize abnormal operating conditions. And the situation that triggers the evaluation, many of them are listed here, that the individual submits questionable data, they don't perform the task for a long time, so that they're rusty at it, or that they perform the task after the procedure has been changed. All of those would trigger the need to have additional training and additional evaluation. Again, let's look at the objective of each of these things and not try and not miss the goal. So in the abnormal operating condition situations, the goal is to detect an abnormal operating condition and mitigate the condition before we have a failure. In the case of the training, we want to make sure we train an individual on all of the important aspects of performing the covered task or the OQ regulation. And we want that individual to be knowledgeable, not only when he takes the exam, but throughout his career. So we want the individual to always be qualified at all times. Okay. Now, there are different tools that you can use to achieve that, but to have an individual be evaluated once every 5 years as a standard, with an idea that he might have misconceptions in between, is not acceptable. So the evaluation procedure has to be frequent enough and triggered by certain enough events that we really are confident the individual is always competent to perform the task. That's the engineering principle. We don't want somebody that doesn't know all the details of performing the task correctly to perform the task. Okay, we've had this discussion of abnormal operating conditions. Recognizing an abnormal operating condition requires that we train an individual to look for a particular abnormal operating condition and know what symptoms need to be there to determine that that abnormal operating condition exists. That makes sense? Okay, would you answer those questions on number 7?
Well, where do you go?
Okay, an abnormal operating condition is the same as an accident. False. Everybody agrees the second one is true. And
I went ahead and
3
answered,
is,
I answered number 3 as true if we've trained them in it. If they have been trained to recognize their abnormal operating conditions that they might encounter, then I'll answer yes to that. But that will be up to us to train them.
I'm good with that. Okay, we've also discussed this, that we want the individual to properly react, and depending on the level of the individual, that doesn't mean necessarily solve the problem. It just means to bucket up the line to where it can be solved. So as an example, a technician may not be expected to solve a particular problem, but then he might give it to the SME, or he might give it to a supervisor, and so forth. Okay, let's. Okay, would you answer those questions, please? It doesn't look like there's much of a disagreement. Okay, the next thing is the record keeping. Again, the regulations require that record keeping procedures be established in the OQ program, and that certain conditions have to be met. So the records need to be created, and then they need to be stored so that they can be retrieved. Let's look at those 2 questions. Would you answer those? It looks like everybody's okay with that.
Okay, let me just say, I would think that once a record must be created when personnel required on a required evaluation, if you really want it to be true. Thank you.
Yeah, the issue is that you need to be able to prove that you've complied with all of the tasks in your program. And so anything that involves performing a task that's required under the OQ program has to be documented. That's the general
There be,
I'm sorry, say it again, please, Ellen. I'm sorry, Helen, did you say something?
No, I left the mic unmuted at that moment.
Oh, okay.
No, I think that's someone else speaking.
Yeah.
Oh. Okay. These are the poll relative to storing the records so that they're retrievable. Would you please answer these questions? Looks like everybody agrees on 1 and 2. Okay, number 1, everybody agrees to. Okay, number 2, operator qualification records are regularly backed up to assure that they will not be lost or damaged. I guess the confusion might be that, I don't know that it's always done, but it certainly should be done. We want backup records so that we're able, in case of a catastrophe at some point, you don't lose all the records. Does anybody want to
Yeah,
comment?
but to say that they are regularly backed up, mine were hard copies. They were kept in a room that would not burn. They were not electronic. Ask Colonial Pipeline about that.
Oh, God.
So mine were, so they weren't now they were added to. Every year's records were added in and stuff like this. As a matter of fact, I've had lawsuits resolved by my records on the pipelines. But they were hard copies, and if we need to make a copy, we went to copy machine, copied that page, and sent it to somebody. So I'm not a fan of electronic IT, and as read the paper the last 2 weeks. So thank you.
Yeah, I don't think the Russians can hack paper copies, or at least not as easily. Okay.
Well, I can also tell you that Exxon wished I did not have hard paper copies when I sent a lawsuit aiming at my employer over to Exxon where it belonged, because my patrol records and dig up responses could show who was doing construction along the highway at that time. So, I mean, anyway, records are records, have whatever you got, but like I said, I made sure they went into, actually one time, some of them went into fireproof cabinets. Thanks.
Yeah, I think certainly the major migration is toward electronic records, but certainly we need to do a better job of securing the access to them. Okay, select the correct responses required to storage. It must be safe. I mean safe for the records, in which case that would be a yes. Nobody answered it as yes, but I assume that the confusion was safe relative to the personnel, and it's not, that wasn't what I was referring to, that the records would be safe. And that the records would be secure, that would be one that I would think needed to be there. And must be accessible from required location. Yes, you have to have records available when you need them. and then must require a password. Well, again, that depends upon whether you want them to be safe or not. But yes, generally, it would require a password to access the records. So we need to discuss to make sure that we understand the issues relative to records. And again, I had in my mind primarily electronic records, but the records need to be safe, that they're not going to be lost permanently. So that means backup, et cetera, and they need to be secure. So that means that people that should not have access to them don't have access to them. So those are requirements. Must be accessible from required locations. Yes, the records are no good if you can't get to them when you need them. And it must contain a password. In general, they need to be secure, and that normally involves a password.
Hey, Frank, by the
Those
way,
are-
the test does not allow, this test did not allow you to select more than one option.
On number three,
Yes.
wow,
So we just chose the
that's
first
my,
one.
let me make a note. Yeah, I
Okay.
must not have clicked correct.
And again, part of my concern about paper records is, you know, I still have pipeline records that go on, that are on 8-track tapes. I have some on 5 1/4-inch single-sided and dual-sided floppies. I have them on 3 1/2-inch single and dual-sided floppies. I have them on bulky hard drives. I have them on flash drives. And I don't find anybody that wants to transfer those things and so forth. But that's okay. It's just record storage.
That's called permanent storage.
Yeah, Frank, isn't the main point here, though, that if you lose records for whatever reason, you're out of compliance? I mean, that's the bottom line.
That's correct. And the same thing, and the results can be catastrophic. Now, for instance, in the San Bruno failure, that a lot of the blame was put on records. The individual regulator may let you get away with that, but certainly the lawyers are not. So if the general procedure that a lawyer or a manager should use is, if you don't have the records, you can't prove you did it. Okay, we've had a discussion of the distinction between NACE certification and operator qualification. I have given you, or have available, a copy of the citation that PHMSA exerted against Enterprise Pipeline, saying that this is a copy of the letter, saying that they didn't, and it's a long involved thing, saying what they didn't do in terms of the OQ program. But let me emphasize, when David was talking about, if you lose records that you have no way of proving that you did that, keep in mind the consequences the industry is putting itself in under this circumstance. If an operator uses a technician who's not truly qualified under the OQ program that the operator has, which is what they're asserting here, that Enterprise did in all of their data collection, any data collected by that technician would not be acceptable because they didn't use a qualified person to collect the data. So Enterprise in this case, or the operator in general, would be out of compliance in making the mandatory requirements that the regulation, measurements that the regulations require. So if an individual's technician is determined to be not qualified to be making measurements, all of those measurements would be rejected by lawyers on the basis that he wasn't qualified to do it under the law. You see the serious consequences of not following the OQ requirements along with the other technical requirements. Okay, let's answer some questions. Okay, if you'd answer these questions, please. Okay, we're agreement there, we're agreement there. Okay, let's pick the ones that are, okay, the NACE typically cover CP concepts. Well, in the CP courses they do. And resistivity concept in the CP ones they do. Recognizing abnormal operating conditions. I don't know any place that NACE discusses abnormal operating conditions. Is that correct, or do you know of any place within the NACE CP training or CP or corrosion training that abnormal operating conditions are covered?
Well, there will be some accidentally and so forth. And okay, another example, I had a regulated pipe being checked by the state regulators, and we had gone out on it and got to a certain point they wanted to look at, and we did, took a reading there on the road test station, and it was bad. And of course, I was letting my junior staff do this, but the CP reading was not good. So I walked over there and I led the group into the woods about 50 yards, found a Kinder Morgan rectifier that supplied and supported that right away right there. And while I was standing there, I opened up his rectifier with my key and it was off. And I called him while I'm standing there and found out that they had had a lightning strike that had taken out that deep anode bed, and that it was scheduled to be repaired and so forth. And I, of course, let him know I had a Railroad Commission inspector there. Did he want to talk to him? And he really didn't want to. And I offered to let the commission guy talk to him, and he didn't really want to talk to him. So I said, okay, no problem. Last month it was just fine when we read their Kinder Morgan rectifier, which was not ours, and knew everything was just fine. So, I mean, accidentally, we knew that there was something wrong in that area. And that was, of course, taught by NACE and CP criteria, and you go investigate changes that happen month to month or things like that. So it would be accident. It would not be guaranteed, or you couldn't depend upon it. Thank you.
So what I would say is, one would be a response I would pick. Two would be a response on the assumption that it's a CP related. I would not generally expect abnormal operating condition training being in there. Time-based evaluations. I've forgotten now how often NACE does not require a reevaluation, do that? They just require you pay money. Is that what the deal is? And you need to say you've studied Is that what you do for the reevaluation in NACE?
Yeah, Frank, I think what they do is you have to show that you've been active, you've been participating in various things, going, to a NACE conference, reading material performance, doing certain things, getting some training and stuff along the way. And you just have to document that. Now, I think that's going to become a little more stringent than what it was, but not much.
Okay. And again, the PHMSA requirements, even though many operators don't follow it, is much more stringent. That there are time-based events, there are events that trigger, that are occasions that things happen that triggers an evaluation. And we'll talk later when we are in the evaluation section. What FARA really prefers is an ongoing evaluation and continuing training, having webinars on a monthly basis where you review the subject matter and go through it, reviewing on an annual basis and doing test evaluations and so forth. Okay, time-based evaluations, I don't think they talk about except for in the context that I just said, so I would not include that. An operator qualification, I would not include that either because it's not typically there. Okay, now is everybody comfortable with the balance between NACE and what PHMSA requires? And again, I am quick to say I'm not criticizing NACE CP courses because I wrote the original NACE CP course. And so it exactly filled the need of what there was at that time. Now what we're doing is trying to add the operator qualification requirements, which are different than what was required originally by PHMSA. Remember, the OQ requirements were added later.
Okay, let me just say, I think this is sort of a date-based thing. And what I mean is PHMSA didn't have any OQ requirements 2 years ago. NACE did have some requirements. PHMSA says NACE is out of compliance right now. I think that's true. NACE may come into compliance in the future, changing their training. I have heard nothing, but they may. But I mean, as of this date, PHMSA has declared that NACE certification only covers maybe CP or something, whatever they limit it to and things. So I think you just can't say it's never been in compliance because at one time it really sort of was in compliance, but now PHMSA has recognized that it wasn't adequate and they've changed it. So anyway, it's a sort of a date-based thing, I think.
Yeah, it's more than 2 years ago that OQ started, but Ed, do you remember when the actual date was?
I hope there's no reason, but it appears we've lost Ed.
Oh.
Or maybe he's off to the arrow or something, anyway.
Yeah, yeah, again, the whole point of this course is to fill in the OQ requirements that have not been covered traditionally by the other companies that dealt with the technical issues. Okay, we're almost at 2 hours, so this lesson fit right into the 2-hour plan. As I said in the email that I sent you with the link to this, in general, the lessons are not tightly fit to 2 hours. Some may take only an hour and some may take 2.5 hours, and we'll overflow or underflow and start early or go late, but we'll stay within the 2-hour time frame. The lesson next Friday is going to be on what needs to go, the details of what needs to go in when you're creating an operator qualification program. I appreciate your attention and I hope you can participate next week. I'll send you an invitation. Thank you very much. Does anybody have any comments or anything else they'd like to say?
Thank you, Frank.
Yep. Thanks to everybody.
congratulations on fixing us to 2 hours. Congratulations.
Yep.
It was a
Claim it.
Thank
Okay.
you, everybody. Thank you, Frank.
guys have-
Yep.
Yeah.
Bye now. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Rizzo. Appreciate the time.
My pleasure. I hope it was helpful.